Hello, and welcome to Entangled, the podcast where we explore the science of consciousness, the true nature of reality, and what it means to be a spiritual being having the human experience. I'm your host, Jordan Youkilis, and this episode, How Did the Egyptians Know Consciousness, continues episode 80, my interview with Chance Gardner. We start with an overview of Schwaller de Lubitz's groundbreaking work on symbolist Egypt called The Temple of Man, and how it inspired the life's work of John Anthony West. Next, we dive into consciousness and the correspondence cipher, focusing on the research conducted by Chance and a team of researchers to explore the knowledge of consciousness embedded in the art and architecture of ancient Egypt. We then discuss cycles of consciousness, the golden scission, and snakes. From there, we consider alchemy as the holy of holies in the temple of consciousness. We end this episode discussing the exalted star Regulus in the age of Aquarius. If you're listening to this episode audio only, I recommend you pull up the text and image version on entangledpodcast.substack.com as a companion, as the images are critical to understanding this episode. Alternatively, the video version of this podcast is available on Substack as well as X at EntangledPod. Music from the show is available on the Spotify playlist Entangled the Vibes. If you like the show, please drop a 5-star review and subscribe on Substack, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Please enjoy the episode. Consciousness. The use of the term consciousness to denote a formative metaphysical power is inadequate in the usual philosophical sense that refers to psychological consciousness, specifically being conscious or being conscious of oneself, that is, ego consciousness. In any case, the functional meaning implied in consciousness or being conscious is to put in relation. Now, when the term consciousness is used to mean a formative metaphysical power, the possibility of relation is excluded because multiplicity does not yet exist in the pre-physical state of creation. The notion evoked by the meaning of the word implies, potentially, the function of putting into relation, and therefore that which provokes the original creative scission, the number one, which must become two. The mystery of this scission remains unsolved, cannot be solved for the psychological consciousness, but with the formative consciousness essence as a starting point. Cosmogonic philosophy is founded on action and therefore functionally situated. As it is, the formative consciousness essence refers to a synthesis of being containing in itself its own opposition, which is the creative function and which will appear later as a generating power throughout the becoming and transformation in all of nature. In the spirit, the material of form, from energy to the densest corporeal state, is nothing but a qualitative speculation, an expression of the consciousness that seeks itself through all its metamorphoses. Therefore, quality is function. R.A. Schwaller de Lubicz, The Temple of Man. In this book, widely considered as magnus opus, Lubicz explains the symbolist interpretation of ancient Egypt. The version of ancient Egypt mainstream Egyptologists dismiss as ridiculous. But anyone who's actually read Lubitz's work knows his theories are not ridiculous, quite the opposite. The Temple of Man is a 1,000+ page tome. It is structured in 2 volumes across 6 parts. First, the doctrine of the anthropocosmos. Second, mathematical thought. Third, the master builder's grid, pharaonic mathematics applied. Fourth, the architecture of the temple themes. Fifth, the pharaonic temple. And sixth, plates, legends, and commentaries. Schwaller de Lubitz's analysis was so persuasive, his findings so groundbreaking, they inspired the life's work of another pioneer of symbolist Egypt, John Anthony West. John Anthony West described Schwaller's writing as abstruse, complex, and uncompromising, and that few readers, even those familiar with metaphysical and philosophical writing, seem comfortable with raw, original Schwaller. I'm about 1/5 of the way through The Temple of Man, and I can substantiate John's assessment. But John also said that he regards Lubitz's contribution as the most important single work of scholarship of this century, one which calls for a total revision of modern man's conception of history and of human social evolution. And I'm inclined to think John was spot on there too. John Anthony West published Serpent in the Sky, The High Wisdom of Ancient Egypt in 1979 to simplify and synthesize Lubicz's findings. Quote, Serpent in the Sky presents a revolutionary, exhaustively documented reinterpretation of the civilization of ancient Egypt. It is a study of the life work of the philosopher, Orientalist, and mathematician, the late R.A. Schwaller de Lubicz. After 2 decades of study, mainly on site at the Temple of Luxor, Schwaller de Lubicz was able to prove that all that is accepted as dogma concerning Egypt and ancient civilization in general is wrong or hopelessly inadequate. His work overthrows or undermines virtually every currently cherished belief regarding man's history and the evolution of civilization. Egyptian science, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy were all of an exponentially higher order of refinement and sophistication than modern scholars will acknowledge. The whole of Egyptian civilization was based upon a complete and precise understanding of universal laws. And this profound understanding manifested itself in a consistent, coherent, and interrelated system that fused science, art, and religion into a single organic unity. In other words, it was exactly the opposite of what we see in the world today. Moreover, every aspect of Egyptian knowledge seems to have been complete at the very beginning. The sciences, artistic and architectural techniques, and the hieroglyphics system show virtually no signs of a period of development. Indeed, many of the achievements were never surpassed or even equaled later on. This astonishing fact is readily admitted by Orthodox Egyptologists, but the magnitude of the mystery it proves is skillfully understated, while its many implications go unmentioned. How does a civilization spring full-blown into being? Look at a 1905 automobile and compare it to a modern one. There is no mistaking the process of development. But in Egypt, there are no parallels. Everything is there right at the start. The answer to the mystery is of course obvious, but because it is repellent to the prevailing cast of modern thinking, it is seldom seriously considered. Egyptian civilization was not a development. It was a legacy. Following an observation made by Schwaller de Lubicz, it is now possible virtually to prove the existence of another and perhaps greater civilization antedating dynastic Egypt and all other known civilizations by millennia. In other words, it is now possible to prove Atlantis and simultaneously the historical reality of the biblical flood. End quote. Here is West in seasons 1 of 2 of Magical Egypt, explaining what Schwaller de Lubicz revealed and why he dedicated 15 years of his life studying the Temple of Luxor, or as Lubicz called it, the Temple of Man.
Our understanding of how the temples functioned was altered forever by the extraordinary research of R.A. Schwaller de Lubicz. Schwaller was a highly educated scientist and scholar of medieval Hermeticism, the ancient mystical tradition that had sprung from the contact of Greek and Egyptian cultures. He spent a great deal of time studying the Gothic cathedrals, where he was impressed by these cathedrals' use of Hermetic principles and sacred geometries to communicate their spiritual meaning. In Egypt, he thought he saw something similar at work and undertook a landmark study of the Temple of Luxor, spending 15 years on site from 1936 to 1951. He carefully recorded and analyzed every minute detail of the temple's design, measurements, and imagery, and shocked the archaeological world with an altogether unexpected finding. This strange temple, which Schwaller would come to call the Temple of Man, was laid out according to the proportions of an idealized male frame.
Schwaller de Lubicz's discoveries at Luxor recovered a lost key which decoded the language of this ancient temple. key that allowed the temple at long last to speak again.
Egyptologist and author John Anthony West.
One of the most dramatic and pivotal discoveries Schwaller made at Luxor was an example of correspondence as a hidden frequency in the language of the temple. In this case, an understanding of this correspondence was the key that unlocked the temple. The various rooms and walls and components of the temple each communicated an exhaustive teaching about the aspect of living man that it corresponded to. Through the esoteric language of correspondence, the temple demonstrated not only the mechanics and biometric data of our physical bodies, but goes on to demonstrate an astonishing understanding of our subtle or spiritual bodies, as described in Eastern, Taoist, and Hindu thought.
The human being embodied in the temple is Pharaoh, who is symbolic of human perfection. Demonstrating the highest level of man's development, Pharaoh is humankind's divine form. The temple clearly expressed a belief that man and the cosmos were one, and that each was fully represented and intertwined within the other. The Egyptians had a sense of spiritual metabolism that bound man and the universe. In man, the assimilation of cosmic and physical nourishment, as depicted in this image of the adult pharaoh nursing at the breast of Isis, leads to the liberation of man's intellectual and spiritual powers. The temple taught the mystical secrets of what Schwaller called the anthropocosm, the human cosmos. The temple graphically communicated the interrelationship between microcosm and macrocosm. Man is not only the culminate creation of the universe, but in fact, man is the universe. The same archetypal rules or nettas that govern man govern the universe, and each can be understood through a study of the other. The Egyptians saw the universe as an entirely conscious creation, an aspect of divine consciousness. The nettas were not gods as we think of them. They were personifications of universal principles and processes, balancing and resolving inherently conflicting aspects of the world. They were real powers that acted when one invited them to by understanding and using the cosmic laws.
The ancients understood that the human body was the temple of the soul and was just as holy in its own way. And in certain instances, they actually reproduced the body or various parts of the body to represent cosmic functions. And so in Egypt, as Schwaller's magisterial scholarship demonstrates to us, the Temple of Luxor is built to exactly the proportions of the male skeleton. And of course in Egypt, other portions of the body were also used to express particular cosmic functions. The face of Hathor, and this is now accepted even by Egyptologists. In fact, it was an Egyptologist who discovered it, who was no longer remembered for having discovered it, A. Barb back in the 1950s, that the face of Hathor represents a uterus. And Hathor is, of course, the mother of all. Her name means the mother of Horus. So we find wherever we look, and I'm sure that the Hindus and in Vedic India also built according to this same understanding and principles. In fact, when Schwaller de Lubicz published, or was ready to publish his grand work, the Temple of Man, the Temple de l'Homme, he downed tools for a bit, because at that time, a massive study called The Hindu Temple by a scholar of Vedic and Hindu doctrine, Stella Kramrisch, produced her book, and Schwaller was amazed and delighted to find that the same geometric and harmonic and numerical principles that were in place and commanded the structure of Luxor were also used by the Hindus and found expression yet again in the Gothic cathedrals, specifically, or perhaps most significantly, in Chartres. So the knowledge was handed down.
West expands on the Temple of Man and Serpent in the Sky. Quote, Schwaller de Lubicz began his work at Luxor on the hunch that the great temple there was the Parthenon of Egypt, that is, a sacred structure built according to strict harmonic proportions. If this hunch could be proven, it would mean that knowledge of harmony and proportion existed some 1,500 years before their alleged invention by the Greeks. This in turn would necessitate a drastic revision of widely held opinions of human social evolution. By the time he had finished his 15 years' work at the site, the nature of the revelations forced upon him by the temple had led Schwaller de Lubicz to reinterpret the whole civilization of ancient Egypt. This interpretation sees Egypt as an organic whole, no one part of which can be legitimately abstracted and studied without at least tacit reference to the manner in which that part interacts with the whole. The analogy of a civilization and its various aspects with the various organs of the human body is to be taken symbolically, if not actually literally. It is more than a mere figure of speech. Egyptian civilization must be regarded organically as existing and passing through its various life phases in time. Whatever the political vicissitudes of Egyptian history, the temple, which was fully responsible for the religious, artistic, philosophical, and scientific life of society, performs its task in full consciousness and deliberation. Egyptian civilization is itself a gigantic gesture, an organized sacred dance whose execution spans 4 millennia. The temple at Luxor, which Schwaller de Lubicz calls the Temple of Man, is the perfect example of this symbolic understanding in action. It is a vast stone symbol, the greatest achievement of New Kingdom Egypt, incorporating within it, or utilizing, the totality of Egyptian wisdom: science, mathematics, geodesy, geography, geometry, medicine, astronomy, astrology, magic, myth, art, symbolism. All of these contribute to the temple and can all be reapproached, studied, and, within the limits of our own understanding, resurrected as we discover the roles these various fields play within the temple structure. The temple tells, in stone, in its proportions and harmonies, its art and sculpture, the story of the creation of man. It signals his development, stage by stage, and it recreates in artistic form man's relationship to the universe. West further describes the temple as, quote, a library containing the totality of knowledge pertaining to universal creative powers embodied in the building itself. On Substack, I've included figures from Lubicz's book as a sample of the beauty and wisdom captured in its pages. Of course, John Anthony West and Schwaller de Lubicz weren't the only ones to recognize the ancients' use of art and architecture to record their knowledge of ultimate reality. Here's another pioneer of symbolist Egypt who you may have heard of.
This is the crucial thing. It's what I've come to realize. It's all about consciousness and about being the possessors of an incredibly varied instrument in our consciousness, of which we use only a tiny fraction, but give great importance to that fraction, and that's the fraction that attends to the material and physical world. And what I've come to realize is that there was developed in the ancient world a kind of science of consciousness. A whole range of techniques and systems were developed to alter human consciousness in a very targeted, specific way in order to allow in particular experiences. And one of those techniques involved not rhythmic dancing, not drumming and music, not hallucinogenic plants, but architecture. When we go, for example, to the Great Pyramid of Giza, I believe that we're dealing with a gigantic instrument to transform human consciousness. created by people who knew exactly what they were doing and who understood the mechanisms of the human mind perfectly. And this is true of sacred architecture and sacred monuments all around the world, whether we're speaking of Angkor Wat, whether we're speaking of Stonehenge, whether we're speaking of the extraordinary statues of Easter Island, some of the amazing megalithic constructions in the Andes. All of these places have in common an influence, an impact upon human consciousness.
Graham Hancock summarizes the aesthetic of the ancients perfectly. It's all about consciousness. Why? Consciousness and the correspondence cipher. In Season 2 of Magical Egypt, Chance Gardner and a team of researchers, including Brad Clausen, Gary Osborne, Richard Casaro, Laird Scranton, and Aaron Cheek, investigate the knowledge of consciousness embedded within the Egyptians' art and architecture. They recognize the Egyptians' use of didactic art, used to transmit information and to teach metaphysical principles through the language of symbolism. Here's Brad explaining what he learned.
The more I started to familiarize myself with brain anatomy, and the more I started to recognize shapes and forms in classical works of art, this point really just kept coming back and kept coming back, that our ancient ancestors knew far more about not only brain anatomy, but they knew about and brain anatomy that was dealing specifically with consciousness, as we've seen in Michelangelo's painting of the creation of Adam and Gerard David's painting of the transfiguration of Christ. Artists were not only depicting brain anatomy, but they were depicting brain anatomy in relationship to divinity, in relationship to God. And these Venus statues are doing the same thing. And the artwork that we're seeing showing brain anatomy isn't just doing it for the sake of facts and just cataloging this is what parts of the brain look like. They're doing it for a very specific reason, to highlight this knowledge that we all carry this mechanism and this machine work in our brains, in our bodies, in our heads, that is able to connect us to higher levels of consciousness, that's able to give us a receiver to receive higher levels of consciousness and to expand and unfold. And some people might call that higher level of consciousness God. Some people might call it just enlightenment. But whatever you want to call it, I think we can clearly show from the artwork of our ancestors that they were trying to communicate something to us about how each one of us is capable of reaching these higher levels of consciousness and reaching these higher states of being, all through ourselves, all through our own person, without any sort of other parties involved or any sort of institutions. That whole idea that the kingdom of God dwells within you. The body is a temple. These sort of things you start to realize are not just fancy sayings that we like to say, but they are scientific truths about how human beings operate and how our consciousness operates within this body, and that the body is not something to be cast aside, but that the body in itself is a vehicle for the transformation and the unfoldment of consciousness.
It might be correctly said that the ancient science conveyed timeless truths about the nexus or connection point between mind and body, or consciousness and the physical universe.
From what I have found, a major tenet, if not the main tenet, of the mystery school teachings was this science of consciousness, was this science of understanding how human beings achieve a higher state. These Venus figurine statues weren't just about fertility, but they were about brain anatomy, and not only just about brain anatomy, but about brain anatomy that deals specifically with consciousness.
So our suspicions about a scientific encryption in ancient art and architecture were beginning to look like they were on solid ground. and that there was going to be a significant bit of evidence that would testify to a missing chapter in the history of science and in human culture. Ancient art proved to be an unexpected doorway to ancient science. But the science seemed to be intimating or indicating a deeper mystery still. What if this culture has been grossly misunderstood? And what we've been thinking of as proto-religious symbols are actually these ingeniously approachable schematics of consciousness itself.
In that clip, Brad mentioned two pieces of Renaissance artwork that depict brain anatomy in relation to divinity. Michelangelo's painting of the creation of Adam and Gerald David's painting of the transfiguration of Christ. These relationships were analyzed and published in scientific journals by Dr. Franklin Meshberger in the October 1990 edition of the Journal of American Medical Association, and by Alessandro Paluzzi et al. In the December 2007 edition of the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine. These discoveries unlock a Pandora's box for history. If the Renaissance artists depicted a profound knowledge of the science of consciousness, what secret knowledge remains hidden in the art and architecture of other cultures? Richard Casaro discovered one of these secrets in a symbol prevalent in ancient civilizations from across the world. Here he is in magical Egypt explaining how he came to discover the God Self icon and what knowledge it conveyed about consciousness.
I've been studying the seminal literature on the lost civilization of Atlantis ever since I was about 12 years old, and slowly my interest and my research grew. When I was a teenager, I began reading books on Atlantis written by field researchers like Augustus Le Plongeon, Zalian Nuttall, and several others. And I started putting together a book of parallels showing all the similarities among old world cultures and new world cultures, cultures that evolved on opposite sides of the world. For example, pyramids are common across the oceans. The practice of mummification is common across the oceans. Hieroglyphic writing is common, and so on and so forth. When I was in college, I spoke with archaeologists, Egyptologists, Mayanists, and just about every scholar that I could find. And they all basically told me the same thing, which is that Atlantis was a myth, and that if I wanted to reignite the debate, I would have to find or discover new evidence that could be debated. And so that's exactly what I set out to do. I started traveling to as many different countries as I could in Europe, Africa, South America, Mesoamerica, and in a very short time I found several new parallels that I claim are evidence for a lost civilization or a higher civilization or a golden age civilization, which ancient peoples like Plato called Atlantis. The triptych temple is probably the most important discovery and the one that I'm most recognized for. But in my opinion, what I call the God Self icon is just as important. It's a phrase I've coined for an image that I've found all across the ancient world, from Mexico to China, from Egypt to India. The God Self icon depicts a human or human-like figure facing forward, holding twin objects symmetrically in both hands. These objects are usually staffs or animals, and often they're serpents. I found it in every major ancient culture that built pyramids, and I recognized that the God Self icon is what I call the missing link, connecting these pyramid cultures to each other and possibly to a golden age mother culture that's so remote in history that it's been forgotten. The God Self icon represents the soul of the hero or sage who balances his opposing bodily forces, which are represented by the twin objects that are being held symmetrically in each hand. In Egypt, the Ankh cross of life was often depicted as a God Self icon because it represented the eternal part of us, the spiritual center within us that we find when we balance our opposing twin sides. The god Osiris, who was the role model for Egypt's masses, was often depicted as a God Self icon in the form of a god called He. Now, He stood for eternity, which is a clear reference to the eternal within us, our spiritual center or soul within that was never born and never dies. One of Egypt's earliest God Self icons is the powerful god Bes, and you can see him depicted atop the high columns of a famous Egyptian temple in Dendera. Incredibly, this depiction of Bes is nearly identical to a God Self icon carved on the gate of the sun in Tiahuanaco, Bolivia, halfway around the world. Here, the creator god Viracocha of the Andes strikes the same powerful God Self icon pose as Bes. For the Inca and pre-Inca stonemasons who worked at Tiahuanaco, and indeed across the ancient Andes, the God Self icon was the main religious symbol. Based on these parallels, it almost seems as if the Egyptians and the Inca and pre-Inca civilizations were somehow descendants of the same golden age mother culture or mother civilization and inheritors of the same tradition. Just as the God Self icon was a central figure in Egypt and in the pre-Inca cultures of Peru and in Bolivia, we also find it right at the beginning in India, the birthplace of Hinduism and home of many advanced megalithic structures. The first known culture in India, the Indus Valley civilization, produced many God Self icon images, and certain aspects of Hinduism, such as non-duality, finding the center between opposites, clearly reflect these ideas, the ideas associated with the God Self icon. I found during the course of my research that the God Self icon has been preserved in Freemasonry, the Masonic fraternity. We see a survival of the God Self icon in a variety of Masonic statues, wall carvings, and so on in the Gothic cathedrals of Europe. The God Self icon was preserved also in an alchemical drawing called the Rebus, which first appeared in the work Azoth of the Philosophers by a man named Basil Valentine in the year 1613. Freemasonry's chief symbols, the compass and the square, are clearly depicted in the Rebus's right and left hands. God Self icons from modern esoteric manuscripts share the same posture. As with the Rebus, the sun is associated with the right hand and the moon with the left hand, and the central hero is clearly poised centered between these extremes, indicating a balance. The Egyptians and all the ancient cultures that were their contemporaries believed that because we live in a fragmented world, we are unable to grasp true reality using our ordinary, everyday consciousness. So they conveyed in their art, and this is the secret of Egyptian art, they conveyed in their art a method by which we can transcend ordinary consciousness and attain higher consciousness and grasp true reality.
So what is the secret method for transcending ordinary consciousness? For attaining higher consciousness and grasping true reality? We'll come back to this question later in the essay. First, let's explore some of the other discoveries found by the Magical Egypt research team, like, say, correspondences with brain anatomy.
I'll say this.
Yeah.
It's obviously a truth to state that the ancients dissected the human body to learn all they could about it. And it is self-evident that they, or possibly an unknown advanced culture before them, did the same with the brain. When we overlay a transparent side view image of the human head onto the ground plan of many sacred places, i.e. mounds, circles, temples and churches, we discover a remarkable thing. The eyes, the mouth, the centre of the brain, the pineal, pituitary, the seventh chakra, bregma, the crown of the head, and its centre, the bindu above the head, all seem to match up with the important elements of the architectural and archaeological sites.
It was a recognition of this correspondence cipher that allowed Gary to make some really important breakthroughs that blew open a wholly unexpected window into the hidden meaning of this profoundly esoteric canon of aesthetics.
Correspondence means a close similarity, connection, or equivalence. For our purposes, we will be looking at examples of geometric or symbolic correspondence and some examples of how correspondences in shape hold the key to understanding a symbol or an entire encrypted message.
So one of the biggest, and by now one of the most web-traded memes, and one of the big breakthroughs that helped us make our own discoveries more clear, was Gary's observation in his book The Shining Ones of an excellent example of the correspondence cipher. A common geometry holds the key to unlocking the cipher and accessing the information held in the symbol. Another example of the correspondence cipher comes from a discovery that Schwaller de Lubicz made that shows the iconic scarab beetle as an exact geometric match for the sutures in the top of the human skull. Gary makes a series of further observations that connect this symbolism to a sophisticated ancient scientific corpus.
The way the skull is stitched together, say it's stitched, but you know, it's the same configuration you have on the back of the scarab with its two wings. Right, so it's the same kind of pattern. Not only that, but because the two wings would be associated with the two sides of the brain, the two hemispheres, but also, more directly, which I think is what the scarab is really about, is the phalanx inside the brain, central optic phalanx, which is, it's kind of shaped like the scarab. It has two sides to it. And it actually looks like, well, it does actually look like two scarabs put together, but you can see it as a whole kind of scarab with the wings on it.
Like my own discovery and like Brad's, Gary's discovery also pointed to the brain and drew specific attention to the thalamus, pineal, and pituitary triad. In Gary's discovery, an additional clue to its relevance is added with the spread wings, which correspond to the hemispheres of the brain. It's not only an aesthetic masterpiece, but is at the same time a weirdly accurate schematic representation of the centrally important structural feature of the brain known as the limbic system. An interesting side note is that for each of us, the schematic correspondences we found were views of the brain from all three axes. or as known by modern medicine, the coronal view, the sagittal view, and the axial view. The pylon charts out these brain articulations from the coronal or frontal view, as does Brad's ram statue discoveries. Gary's iconic discovery of the Eye of Horus and its correspondence with the limbic system represents a side or sagittal view. Gary offered another series of discoveries that show correspondences encrypted into the art, this time of brain architecture as seen from the underside of the brain looking up, or the axial view.
Because you know the Aztec crown, worn by Cyrus and other gods. If you look at the underside of the brain, the actual crown is an image of the underside of the brain. And when you're looking at the thalamus and the pineal and the pituitary, the orbs that are on the crown relate to the pineal and the pituitary. And the thalamus is the actual crown itself. It's a closed part of the thalamus, but it's closed. But when you open it up, you have the feathers, the ophthals, on the side, which is really the sides of the thalamus, how it appears when you're looking underneath the brain.
This Egyptian headdress symbol, when compared directly to the axial view of the diencephalon, shows how remarkable these images are, not only for their beauty and their balance as visual ornamentation, but at the same time transmitting these weirdly accurate schematics of this central brain architecture. In this image, we can see the twin curves of the corpus callosum in the snakes, and the central stalk, like the Atef crown, is a perfect schematic of the arrangement of the pineal and pituitary in relation to the thalamus. As I looked through other medical illustrations, I saw more and more correspondences that made the connection more and more difficult to dismiss. The orbs on the head of the snakes, while symbolizing the rising sun, also seem to directly schematize the exact same structure in the amygdala. As I compared and superimposed other examples that Gary cited, I saw more and more evidence that this aesthetic carried some very sophisticated technical schematics of these important centers of consciousness.
On Substack, I've included 5 PDFs of summary findings from the Magical Egypt Research Project. These findings demonstrate, first, the Egyptian ram sphinx schematizes the ventricles and articulations of the brainstem. Second, the Osiris statuary correspondences with the articulations of the brainstem. Third, the Egyptian Atef crown or Atef symbol is a schematic of the diencephalon. Fourth, Mesopotamian Ishtar, Iana, and Artemis statuary schematize the human brainstem. And fifth, the pylon temple facade indicates and templates the articulations of brainstem and cerebrum. It's also worth highlighting that the Egyptians understood the human individual as a cipher corresponding to the universe itself. That is what's meant by the term anthropokosmos, as above, so below. John Anthony West explains, quote, Egypt understood man as a whole, but because Egypt also understood the universally valid principle of hierarchy, her knowledge of the physical organism was intimately related to her understanding of the greater realms of which man's physical organism is a part. Man is the sum of the principles that pervade and organize the universe. He is the self-perfecting product of the grand experiment that is organic life on Earth, embodying within himself the mineral, vegetable, and animal kingdoms. His body is the temple designed to permit him to carry out the right of self-perfection, the only legitimate human goal. All other goals lead to apathy or disaster, as is obvious from any daily newspaper. Man is a model of the universe. If he understands himself perfectly, he also understands the universe. Astronomy, astrology, geography, geodesy, measure, rhythm, proportion, mathematics, magic, medicine, anatomy, art, all are linked in a grand dynamic scheme. No aspect can be isolated from another and treated as a separate specialty or field without distortion and destruction. In Egypt, the very language employed in the medical papyri, the nomenclature employed to distinguish the parts of the body, reflects this fabulous capacity for synthesizing, for automatically suggesting the intimate links between microcosm and macrocosm. End quote. Cycles of consciousness, the golden scission, and snakes. The research team also brought to light profound understandings related to the cyclical nature of consciousness, as discussed by Chance Gardner and Gary Osborne in this next clip.
When I talked to Gary about the idea that ancient symbolism might hold schematics of consciousness, he not only agreed, but he gave me some specific examples. This is by no means the only example, but an important one that schematizes one of the primary attributes. In this case, one of the major defining features of consciousness, its primary cyclical nature.
The ancient Egyptians had a great way of describing consciousness. They used the daily cycle of the sun. You know, the four psychoanalytical states: conscious, unconscious, superconscious, subconscious. You can apply those to the cycle. You know, you've got the positive side of the cycle being the conscious, everyday self, self-conscious. And you've got the negative half of the cycle, would be the subconscious. And then you've got the 2 points in the cycle, which would be the unconscious. You see, when we were talking about this before, I said that we kind of skip over those points. We become unconscious at those points. Yeah. When we fall asleep, we just unconscious. We don't know when we fall asleep. We just fall asleep. That's it. If you try to remain awake at the point of sleep, then you're going to the hypnagogic state. But we usually pass that point unconsciously. They're just using the sun on the horizon to kind of symbolize those 2 points in the cycle, where the negative half of the cycle crosses over into the positive, and the positive crosses over into the negative. Yeah, so you've got the positive half of the cycle, which would be the conscious self, the male-related conscious self. You've got the negative half of the cycle, which would be the female subconscious. You've got the 2 points in the cycle, those midpoints, those neutral points that I'll be talking about, which would be the hypnagogic state. They would be the unconscious. And if you become conscious at the points where you use the unconscious, they become superconscious, and those 2 points become 1 point in the center. So that's the four psychoanalytical states of consciousness applied to the cycle. The tetragrammaton, you know, you've got the 4 letters, the Hebrew letters of the name of God. The 2 He letters would be the gateway points, would be the 2 points in the cycle. So you've got Yah. You start off with a positive half of the cycle. You've got the He point, which is the pompic state. You've got the Vowel, which would be the female dark side, and then you've got the He again. So the 2 He points are those 2 points in the cycle. So the tetragrammaton, the name of God, is actually the cycle, the consciousness. So those will be the 2 points in the cycle. That's why you have the 2 He's. But also it's like Heru, Horus. You know, so you've got God, you've got Yod, He, Vau, He. You've got Yod, which would be Osiris, He, Horus, Vau, Isis, He, Horus again. So Horus represents that third force. So Osiris represents the male opposite, Isis represents the female opposite, and Horus represents the third force, the child produced from the 2 opposites.
With this observation, Gary brings us to an idea that's key to understanding one of the most central tenets of the ancient science. This idea of the unification or synergy of the polarities to create a child of the 2 has layers of significance that extend from the lowest physical registers to the highest psycho-spiritual registers. This is a foundational idea in alchemy. The child symbolizes an emergent state of consciousness that's known by different names in different cultures. The shamanic state, the hypnagogic state, the visionary trance state. There are many other names. Eventually, my interest in the mechanics of creativity led me to these other parallel traditions that, all in their own way, involve codifying and accessing alternate modes of consciousness, each seeming to involve similar descriptions of a sense of the other, speaking to you through channels that are difficult to put into words, but are unmistakable in character as being decidedly outside of ordinary waking consciousness. It seems that accessing these states was a central focus of many, if not all, of our most ancient ancestor cultures. And it seems that the ancient science encrypted into the art carried roadmaps to accessing these states of consciousness.
The cycles of space, time, and consciousness were instrumental in the Egyptians' understanding of reality. So too was their understanding of numbers and functions. One function in particular, phi, or the golden ratio, stood above all others in cosmological importance. John Anthony West explains in Serpents in the Sky, quote, phi, the golden scission. The letters of Egypt are founded upon number, as are the Egyptian hieroglyphics. Numbers may be called the language of the absolute, a statement that is not meant as metaphor, but as a close analogy, and one that may soon be receiving official corroboration. Advances in linguistics make it even ever more apparent that the human language is not an evolved system of ape talk, but rather a mysterious totality, the fundamentals of which may be common to all people despite the vast differences between individual languages. More than 50 years ago, the alchemist Fulcanelli declared that certain sounds and combinations of sounds had the same meanings no matter what language they occurred in, though the original meaning might well have been lost over the ages. Knowledge of these combinations is probably what lies behind the science of spells, chants, and incantations, which become superstition when the underlying knowledge is lost and only the outward form remains. In any case, the universality of phonetic significance is receiving some support these days, and all sound is reducible in principle to frequencies, that is to say, to number. Analogically, the letters serve as the consonants of a cosmic language. The vowels are provided by the interactions between the letters. These interactions are all based upon and related to the functions that result from the primordial scission. One of the most important of these we call phi, the golden section. Perhaps the greatest single achievement within Schwaller de Lubitz's reinterpretation is the solution of the ultimate meaning of the golden scission, a problem that has occupied many of the greatest thinkers and artists of history. When the significance is divulged, the reader may well be puzzled as to why so apparently elementary an explanation should have remained a mystery for so long. Yet the fact is that the solution eluded the genius of Leonardo and of Kepler, of a number of brilliant modern biologists, and of a host of astute artists and researchers in aesthetics. The answer to the mystery's amazing persistence can only lie in the fact that the cause of number, the primordial scission, was never grasped. Yet it is known that phi controls the proportions of innumerable living organisms, that the spiral of the spiral galaxy is a phi spiral, that the orbits of the planets of our solar system are in complex phi relationships to each other, and that the proportions of Gothic cathedrals and Greek temples are commanded by phi. Though long before Schwaller de Lubitz's work, a number of other scholars had noted phi proportions in the pyramids and other Egyptian remains, only in the past few years has this been acknowledged by Egyptologists. Even now, attempts are made to show how the Egyptians might have used the golden section without actually realizing they were doing so. But the fact is that the Egyptians knew and used phi from the earliest dynasties, as well as the so-called Fibonacci numbers that devolved from phi. A line, AC, is divided at B in such a way that AB is to BC as AC is to AB. In other words, the smaller portion is to the larger portion as the larger is to the whole. The ratio AB to BC is equal to the ratio of AC to AB, and this ratio is phi, or 1.6170339. Continuing. Expressed in simple mathematical terms, this may scarcely seem earth-shaking. But how do we know where to draw the line, where to place point B? When we show geometrically how we arrive at phi and relate this to the number symbolism as we described before, we may catch a glimpse of its universal significance. Phi, consequence of scission. Because the physical universe is ideal or foreshadowed in four terms, we legitimately symbolize its physical aspect with a square, which represents unity. Remember that 4 is an analog of unity. Unity becomes duality. We divide the square in half. The diagonal of each half brought down to the baseline creates phi, the golden scission. Often the curious prevalence of phi in natural forms is noted, as it's its relationship to the Fibonacci series and the manner in which the Fibonacci series also turns up in nature. Sometimes it is studied in detail for its power in generating proportions. But phi and other irrationals are still regarded as a special class of number, and it is this point of view that prevents science and mathematics from understanding the significance of the irrational. The irrational as a function. Phi is not a number, it is a function. To regard the irrational as a number, even as a special class of number, is to reduce the concept of number to meaningless. Number implies the capacity to enumerate, and it is by definition impossible to enumerate with an irrational. We cannot have or imagine 1.618 chickens or 3.141 eggs. Phi, pi, and the square roots of 2, 3, and 5 are all that are required to form all perfect geometric solids, and to define and describe all possible harmonic combinations. It is this web of interactions, this vast complex of harmonies, that we respond to as the world, in this case, the physical world, which is but one, the tangible, perceivable aspect of the spiritual world or world of consciousness. The key to this harmonic world is number, and the means by which number is to be understood is geometry. The whole of Egyptian civilization, over the course of its 4,000-year history, must be regarded as a single ritual gesture, an act of homage to the divine mystery of creation. Unity, in taking consciousness of itself, unfolds into a creation multiplicity and thereby into the universe. Tum, in regarding himself, creates a tum out of none, the primordial waters. The Big Bang Theory, which sees the universe as a physical event resulting out of a critical buildup of purely physical forces, is a trivialized, despiritualized version of this myth. Egypt created a civilization upon it. Christianity explains the Egyptian revelation as God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost. And while fundamentalists vehemently affirm the literal truth of the virgin birth, and science vehemently denies it, in this aspect of esoteric cosmology, the Virgin may be regarded as equivalent to Nut, the sky, the necessarily virgin matrix of principal substance. The primordial scission provokes a situation that can be schematized by geometry. We can show that the single act automatically sets in motion the sequence of whole numbers and of the irrationals, which we represent as diagonals. Irrationals are not to be regarded as numbers or as a special class of numbers, but as functions. Diagonals define the interactions between numbers. And intimately linked to the number symbolism in geometry are the various harmonic scales, which may be shown, either geometrically or mathematically, to be derived from the numbers set in play by the primordial scission. Harmony rapidly becomes extremely complex, and perhaps because of this, obscures for our senses its fundamental role in the creation of form. It is harmony that is responsible for the specific physical phenomena that scientists call reality, but that wiser men realize is but the physical aspect of reality to which our senses have access. We speak of musical form. We know it is the result of harmonies that may be reduced to vibrations, that is to say, to number. But we tend to think of musical form metaphorically, whereas we should regard it literally. Sound is volume. From the modern point of view, we say sound fills space. It is therefore scientifically volume. From the point of view of the more accurate esoteric science, we would say that sound is volume and therefore sound is space. In either case, it is volume. It is literally form, as in a cat or a cathedral. All are the result of an interplay of harmonics, ultimately number. The absolute expresses itself through number, the netters, and number is the divine language. A cat is a poem or sonata of God. Literally. End quote. The importance of number generally, and phi specifically, to Egyptian cosmology cannot be understated. As many of the magical Egypt researchers have highlighted, the knowledge of all wisdom traditions or mystery schools appears to trace back to ancient Egypt and a lost civilization that existed prior to the Younger Dryas period, commonly referred to as Atlantis. These wisdom traditions understand the principles of Hermetic philosophy, which includes the self-evident truth, as above, so below. All forms in our manifest universe came to be from a field of unity, and phi is the ratio from which existence comes to be. Complex systems are self-similar at different scales, and this is why we see the golden ratio and Fibonacci sequence everywhere in nature. On Substack, I've included a figure from Dr. Joe Dispenza's book, Becoming Supernatural, which shows that if you follow the golden ratio along the circumference of the brain, the spiral will end at the exact point of the pineal gland. We'll have more to say about the pineal gland shortly. Next up in our analysis of how the Egyptians understood consciousness, it's time to explore that sneaky, slithering animal. It's time to ask, what's with all the snakes?
After years of studying ancient symbolism and the ancient aesthetic, there was a cluster of symbols that edged to the forefront of the research, partially because of the sheer ubiquity of them, and partially because they seemed to represent one of the centrally important ideas of the ancient world. The close parallels that we find in so many of the ancient cultures allow us to fill in missing pieces that once obscured this message. In this episode, we will attempt to answer the simple question that this symbolism raises. Why was this particular schematic so important to so many of our most ancient cultures? The great secret that is encoded in this set of symbols is nothing less than the central secret of one of the most arcane and forbidden lineages of esotericism.
The snake or serpent is one of those universal symbols that pops up everywhere, and different forms. There are feathered and winged snakes, there are water snakes, there are cobras, there are snakes everywhere. And the snake is one of these terrifically rich symbols. It can't really be, whole books have been written on serpent symbolism. So it's not easy to, let's say, do it in 25 words or less. But I hate the words good and bad snakes, or good and evil snakes. There are beneficial, or let's say constructive or sacred snakes, and there are other, let us say, counter snakes, maleficent snakes, representing negative forces. Negative forces are just as sacred as positive forces, actually. In Egypt, Set is a great god, the opponent of Horus, and without Set, who represents the concretization or the materialization of spirit into form, there would be no form, there would be no manifestation. Well, that understanding is systemic. It prevails virtually everywhere, and even though, let's say me personally, I don't know that much about Buddhist or Hindu architecture, you can see just from the pictures that we have, or I can see that there are close parallels when you see in a Thai temple a five-headed snake. All of a sudden, there's a five-headed snake in the Book of the Duat, in the fifth hour of the Book of the Duat in Egypt, and there are everywhere that you look. For example, there's, I believe it's in Chichen Itza, where at, not sure if it's the solstice or the equinox, the sun forms a serpent of light going up the stairway. Well, obviously this is not an accident. Nobody goes to all of that trouble to orient the temple in exactly that way in order to get a pretty picture of isn't that curious, the snake crawls up the stairway at the equinox. Somewhere along the line, somebody has to start thinking that maybe these guys knew what they were talking about, and not only that it was deliberate, I think that would be understood, but why was it deliberate, and what was the effect of that particular phenomenon? It was not something to amuse a bunch of tourists who were paying a lot of money to go to Chichen Itza. It served for them a different purpose altogether, and it's really incumbent upon our scholars to use or to direct their expertise to trying to figure out what it was that what it was that legitimately provoked the ancients to go to all this trouble to produce those kinds of effects through that kind of symbolism.
One of the most obvious parallels in symbolism that we see from the ancient world is the iconic image of twin snakes. In ancient Egypt, we see Thoth, the bringer of civilization and the teacher of magic, wielding the twin snakes, each wound around a staff. The twin snakes are differentiated as polar opposites through the indication of the symbolic crowns. In the case of the caduceus, and in the Vedantic symbol system, the snakes are interwoven or intertwined. In Eastern sacred motifs, the snakes or dragons are also paired and converge to form a new entity or a new intelligence. Or, as indicated here, a flaming pearl-like object, situated exactly correspondent with the third eye as seen in this overlay. Through the use of this ingenious way of using art and architecture as a didactic or a teaching template, and through a series of symbolic and visual correspondences, a special emphasis is revealed, a chart of sorts, that indicates the area of the third eye and draws attention to a special nexus or conjunction of different biological systems. In the case of many of our most distant ancestor cultures, this area of the brain corresponding to the third eye is associated with a particular type of snake symbolism and with the idea of conjunction or unification. The uraeus is an iconic example of the association of snakes in the third eye, but as we'll see, this association is far from being unique to ancient Egypt. So what exactly was the secret that this culture held so important as to base their entire aesthetic canon on immortalizing and transmitting?
And that brings us back to the $64,000 question. Why did the Egyptians and ancient civilizations around the world base the entire aesthetic of art and architecture around consciousness? If the Mystery School's temple is the science of consciousness, then alchemy is its holy of holies.
The most exalted application of alchemy is the inner process, when alchemy represents the metaphor of taking the basic consciousness that we are born with and transmuting it or transforming it into the higher consciousness that is in fact both our birthright and our privilege.
At this point in the research project, the team has discovered a number of points of divergence between the orthodox views of mainstream Egyptology and evidence expressed by the art, architecture, and the culture-wide aesthetic canons that are still visible in the ruins of this ancient and deeply enigmatic culture.
Esoterically speaking, they talk about having two births, that the first birth you're born by water, the water of the womb of your mother, and then the second birth you're born by fire or by light. I think that the Eye of Horus is the quintessential symbol for this physiological, biological process or science of regeneration, in that it is not only showing the ventricles of the brain and the diencephalon of the brain of the hypothalamus, the optic thalamus, the pituitary, and the pineal gland, showing that this process is dealing with not only neuroanatomy and neurophysiology, but it is also showing this idea of an eye in our mind, or this interface of the mind's eye. And I think that's really what this concept of a third eye is. And when you close your two eyes, you still can see things in your mind. So you have this third visual capability. We also see the eye as a symbol for comprehension and for understanding and for knowledge. When we understand something, we say, I see what you mean. Or you could say, you don't see where I'm coming from. We talk about sight being synonymous with comprehension and perception and understanding. So the symbol of this single eye deals not only with this idea of vision, but it deals with understanding, it deals with knowing, it deals with perception in a very sort of symbolic way. When you're in the darkness and you're in ignorance, you don't have any information, but light comes in and it shows you and you're able to see, and you gain information through seeing, right? This symbol of the Eye of Horus is showing us this physiological process of this science. And in order to understand how this science works, you have to really understand this process of physiology, and you have to understand how the physiological alchemical laboratory of the body works.
And therein lies the grand secret of the mystery schools, that alchemy is real and arguably the most important of the sacred sciences. Yet modern science would have you believe that the bastardized version of external alchemy, chemistry, is all that exists, while having you believe that internal alchemy, the transmutation of lead waking state consciousness into the gold of cosmic consciousness, is nothing more than a fairy tale. Nothing could be further from the truth. Brad Clausen continues discussing the secrets of internal alchemy in the season 2 finale of Magical Egypt.
In this Nadon alchemy, there's what is known as the Dantians, and Dantian translates to elixir field. Needham referred to them also as areas of vital heat, but you see them as they have them as this upper Dantian, this middle Dantian, and the lower Dantian. The upper Dantian refers to the brain, the middle Dantian refers to the heart or the thorax, and the lower Dantian refers to the lower abdomen. And in Western esotericism, you have the same kind of concept, but it's the lower Dantian deals with the sexual organs. And that also ties into this idea of the 3 primary vitalities of Qing, Qi, and Shen, where Qing correlates to the sexual organs and Qi correlates to the heart and Shen correlates to the brain. The interesting thing about that concept is that there are other examples in the world of these same 3 chambers, and you see them in the layout of the chambers of the Great Pyramid, and you see them in the layout of Teotihuacan, and we also see it in the biblical tabernacle in the wilderness that is based off of a standard Egyptian temple, which has an outer court, an inner court, and a Holy of Holies. The best example I heard of that is that the outer court is sort of this open pelvic cavity, which again would deal with this lower half of the body. The inner court would be the ribs that are dealing with the lungs and the heart, and the organs in there, and the Holy of Holies again is the brain. But the really interesting to note about this is when you look at these interior chambers of the pyramid, the Queen's chamber is kind of off to the side when you're looking at it at this particular angle. And when you look at Teotihuacan, the pyramid of the sun is also showing that same kind of just slightly over to the side. And the heart sort of does a similar thing as well. So I think what we're seeing here in the pyramid, in the layout of the chambers of the pyramid and the layout of Teotihuacan and the layout of the tabernacle in the wilderness is this same idea of these laboratories of the body, of the sexual organs, the heart, and the brain. And these are sort of these places that are processing all of this fluid, and these are the ways that you are cycling circulating these fluids through. The other really interesting thing about the similarity between the layout of the chambers of the pyramid and Teotihuacan is that where you have the ground layer that the pyramid sits on, the subterranean pit is below that. And when you look at the layout of Teotihuacan, the pyramid of the feathered serpent, there is this Rio San Juan that kind of marks the same line that you see the ground marking in the pyramid, and that would again be showing this lower half or this lower base animal half. And the pyramid of the feathered serpent is showing, again, that idea of the kundalini, or this coiled energy that would rise up the spine, up to the brain.
The temples, even as they stand in ruin, still yield a massive amount of information. Not only is the temple a perfect correspondence to the human body, but the rituals performed in each room give the central revelation, the key to mastery of that corresponding system in the psyche or the body. Of all the secret information transmitted by the temple, the most important was the ritual activity that took place at the site of the third ventricle.
The really interesting aspect of Schwaller's revelation about the temple of Luxor being related to the human body is this idea of the Holy of Holies, or this secret sanctuary. And what Schwaller points out at Luxor is that in this Holy of Holies, it was a sanctuary for the Egyptian god Amun, who is a ram-headed god. And again, we see that association of the ram with the brain. But the really interesting thing is that Amun his name means hidden. So he is the hidden god. And in interesting correlation in Hebrew, hidden and the word eternal are the same. So based off of Schwaller's work, in the Holy of Holies, at the Temple of Luxor, there was a golden ram-headed statue representing a hidden god. And Schwaller also points out that the Holy of Holies is representative of the third ventricle. And we see this time and time again, the significance of the third ventricle, the brain, the middle part of the brain. If anybody who's familiar with any sort of religious text or anything understands that in the Holy of Holies, this is where the high priest makes contact with God, or has the epiphany of God, that there's some sort of communication going on between the priest and with God, and this is also where information is received. So why the third ventricle? Why this emphasis on the third ventricle? Why were our ancestors making artwork associating the third ventricle with the Most High, or their higher consciousness or higher knowing? Now, in order to explain this, we have to venture into subjects like neuroanatomy and neuroendocrinology, two very complex and complicated subjects that I am just beginning to learn the basics of. So bear with me as I proceed. I'm clearly not a neuroscientist. The third ventricle sits around some of the most important and critical parts of the brain, such as the diencephalon, which sits atop the brainstem. The third ventricle is a thin space between the two halves of the thalamus, and the lateral walls of the third ventricle are formed by parts of the thalamus and parts of the hypothalamus. So parts of the diencephalon, the motherboard of the brain, are constantly bathed in cerebral spinal fluid. The diencephalon, which has been referred to as the motherboard of the brain, is composed of the hypothalamus, including the posterior lobe of the pituitary, the thalamus, the subthalamus, and the epithalamus, which includes the pineal gland. The hypothalamus controls the endocrine system by secreting hormones via the infundibulum into the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, which in turn then secretes its own hormones into the blood in order to communicate with the other endocrine glands, which in turn, those other glands then secrete their own hormones into the blood based off of the hormones that they have been sent. So different hormones are constantly being intermingled and mixed into the blood, changing the chemical makeup of the blood. Anatomists like Galen and Avicenna believe that the soul was like a vapor billowing through or filling up the ventricles or the caves of the brain. As time went on and we learned more about the ventricles, they eventually lost their mystical caves of the soul status and were just reduced to being merely cisterns or sinks for the cerebral spinal fluid, which is produced by the ventricles. The cerebral spinal fluid is created by blood being filtered through the choroid plexus in the ventricles. And along with the cerebrospinal fluid that is generated in the third ventricle, more of it pours down from above via the lateral ventricles, and that cerebrospinal fluid then makes its way down to the fourth ventricle. Some of it then proceeds down the spinal cord, and some of it proceeds out the back of the brain, out of the back of the brainstem, and then fills up the subarachnoid space and bathes the brain. And the cerebrospinal fluid serves many functions, some of which would be providing a protective cushion for the brain, providing nutrition to the brain, and removing waste.
To the ancient mind, there was something more important than the immediate physical functions of the cerebrospinal fluid. The ventricles represent the nexus between the systems, a conjunction point of the three biological factories, as Brad calls them. It is the nexus between the circulatory system and nervous system. Not only is this sacred space the nexus between biological systems, but in a very real sense, it is the nexus between biology and consciousness. It seems to be the crossover point where body gives rise to mind. The idea of the nexus is another one of those ideas that the cultural aesthetic expressed and clearly held in high regard. The practice of crossing the arms of the deceased as part of the funerary process was symbolically associated with this crossover between the internal and external worlds. The modern specialized science that tracks this complicated interaction at this nexus point is called neuroendocrinology.
And this connection of the central nervous system to the endocrine system is what is referred to as neuroendocrinology, and it is through neuroendocrinology where the physiological functions of the body are regulated. The anatomy and functionality of the neuroendocrinological physiology of the body is one of the main keys to unlocking and understanding the teaching of this ancient esoteric wisdom tradition. For they taught the practice of using the body as the laboratory for refining or distilling or purifying the fluids of the body, making them chemically perfect, in order to generate a pure fuel coursing through the physiological processes of the body, feeding the brain, and that when sparked, can ignite the engine of higher consciousness. And we'll be able to show that it is through this part of our brain where we can connect to all-knowing and all-seeing, and that this is the true meaning of the all-seeing eye.
Manly P. Hall, considered the godfather of modern esotericism, wrote extensively about the significance of alchemy. I'll share some sections from his masterpiece, The Secret Teachings of All Ages. Quote, "Alchemy, the secret art of the land of Chem, the ancient name for Egypt, is one of the two oldest sciences in the world. The other is astrology. The beginnings of both extend back into the obscurity of prehistoric times. According to the earliest records extant, alchemy and astrology were considered as divinely revealed to man so that by their aid he might regain his lost estate. According to old legends preserved by the rabbins, the angel at the gate of Eden instructed Adam in the mysteries of Kabbalah and of alchemy, promising that when the human race had thoroughly mastered the secret wisdom concealed within these inspired arts, the curse of the forbidden fruit would be removed and man might again enter into the garden of the Lord. As man took upon himself coats of skin, physical bodies, at the time of his fall, so these sacred sciences were brought by him into the lower worlds, incarnated in dense vehicles through which their spiritual transcendental natures could no longer manifest themselves. Therefore, they were considered as being dead or lost. The earthly body of alchemy is chemistry, for chemists do not realize that half of the book of Torah is forever concealed behind the veil of Isis, and that so long as they study only material elements, they can at best discover but half of the mystery. Astrology has crystallized into astronomy, whose votaries ridicule the dreams of ancient seers and sages, deriding their symbols as meaningless products of superstition. Nevertheless, the intelligentsia of the modern world can never pass behind the veil which divides the seen from the unseen, except in the way appointed, the mysteries. Alchemy teaches that God is in everything, that he is one universal spirit manifesting through an infinity of forms. God, therefore, is the spiritual seed planted in the dark edge of the material universe. By art, it is possible so to grow and expand this seed that the entire universe of substance is tinctured thereby and becomes like unto the seed, pure gold. In the spiritual nature of man, this is termed regeneration. In the material body of the elements, it is called transmutation. As it is in the spiritual and material universes, so it is in the intellectual world. Wisdom cannot be imparted to an idiot because the seed of wisdom is not within him. But wisdom may be imparted to an ignorant person, however ignorant he may be, because the seed of wisdom exists in him and can be developed by art and culture. Hence, a philosopher is only an ignorant man within whose nature a projection has taken place. Through art, the process of learning, the whole mass of base metals, the mental body of ignorance, was transmuted into pure gold, wisdom, for it was tinctured with understanding. If then, through faith and proximity to God, the consciousness of man may be transmuted from base animal desire, represented by the masses of the planetary metals, into a pure, golden, and godly consciousness, illumined and redeemed, and the manifesting God within that one increased from a tiny spark to a great and glorious being. If also the base metals of mental ignorance can, through proper endeavor and training, be transmuted into transcendent genius and wisdom, why is the process in two worlds or spheres of application not equally true in the third? If both the spiritual and mental elements of the universe can be multiplied in their expression, then by the law of analogy, the material elements of the universe can also be multiplied if the necessary process be ascertained. End quote. When the human race has thoroughly mastered the secret wisdom concealed within the inspired arts of Kabbalah and alchemy, the curse of the forbidden fruit will be removed, and man might again enter into the garden of the Lord. If Paul's right about that, it's safe to say the stakes are high. It might also explain why the adversaries of God would be hyper-focused on suppressing this knowledge. I'll now share one final magical Egypt clip in which Chance Gardner brings home this discussion on alchemy.
Our garden of strange and dangerous ideas sprawls concentrically around a secret. The central secret of the temple, and the central secret of you. A secret circuitry that acts as the ignition trigger for a higher consciousness that is available to all, but actually achieved only by very few. In the process of researching these symbols and the traditions that are associated with them, both from ancient Egypt and medieval alchemy, and from later esoteric and fraternal sources, there was a subtle but all-important thing traditions all had in common. The tendency to describe the godhead or divinity in triads, in threes. The Kabbalistic tree of life is another timeless esoteric etalon that schematizes the universe as being structured in a nested series of triads. We see the same underlying triads in alchemy with the three tools of the alchemist and the iconic three central agents of alchemy, salt, sulfur, and mercury. The alchemist's tools are consistent from image to image. The three constants are the furnace, the bellows, and the athanor. In light of Brad's research regarding the three factories, it became clear that the furnace represented the lowest Dantian, the lowest factory whose primary nature was heat or metaphysical fire. This is the engine of the sexual body. The bellows corresponds to the middle Dantian, or the middle factory, which corresponds in the temple overlay to both the heart and the lungs. Both the pumping action of the heart and the intensifying effect that the bellows and compressed air has on the fire are both ingeniously represented in this symbolism. This is the engine of what Schwaller de Lubicz calls the corporeal body. The Athenor corresponds to the upper dantian, the upper factory, the domed cave where the chemical wedding takes place. Once again, the technique of geometric correspondence is used in a brilliant application of esoteric symbolism. As Gary Osborne pointed out in episode 3, the remarkably specific schematics contained in the Atef crown design show very explicitly this central thalamic cluster. Notice not only the shape, which is an exact match for the alchemical alembic, but also the ridges or grooves that resemble a garlic clove or a tulip bulb. This is the same feature that's included in many alchemical illustrations and signals how many ancient esoteric artists were in on the joke. The highest factory, the upper dantian, contains the diencephalon, which is the entire third eye complex, the pineal gland, the pituitary, and the thalamus. This is the place where the product of the lower two factories, the red and white tinctures as they're called, are joined in the bridal chamber for the chemical wedding. At the nexus, the meeting place or conjunction point for the nervous and circulatory systems. It seems that the opus of the message of the temple and the central secret of alchemy are both anchored here, and the real importance of the triad becomes especially clear. When the three factories, or three dantian, have all been raised, or maximized, or realized, brought up to a certain threshold of operation, a truly miraculous, and for the most part in the West, a totally unacknowledged thing takes place. The three factories go into a kind of fission, for lack of a better word, and a threshold event takes place, where one's subjective state of consciousness shifts or restructures in a very interesting and very dramatic way. As we've shown again and again, at least one layer of significance held in this timeless esoteric symbolism corresponds to the biological centers and circuits involved in normal consciousness, but additionally seem to point to a higher, special state of operation that's not automatically granted by nature but must be earned, actively sought after. The radiant triangle represents a new, higher state of consciousness that's enabled or achieved or activated through a perfect union of the three systems, represented by their termination and governing points, the pineal, pituitary, and thalamus. So, the triad that is the basis for many of our oldest metaphors for divinity appears to have been encrypted schematics of the biology of human consciousness. An indication that in some sense, the triune Godhead is the triad that's responsible for natural consciousness, and when properly activated, can have a dramatic amplifying effect on consciousness, not unlike changing the station of a radio or television. Activation in just about every tradition involves a balance or synergy or union of the two polarities of the triad, which activates the neutral third term. When all three are, as Brad calls it, ignited, this event is the basis for a higher state or operational frequency of consciousness. This is what both the Egyptian Eye of Horus signifies and what the later symbol known to Masons as the Eye of Providence is referring to. So the real reason at the core of all the triad symbolism was this. This is the point of ignition. This is where the ancient science goes from speculative to operative. This is the triggering mechanism that lights the lamp of higher consciousness.
The science of consciousness, as not just a theoretical science, but also an applied science, is one of the central themes I've emphasized throughout the Entangled podcast. We find this emphasis on internal alchemy in wisdom tradition after wisdom tradition. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi brought to light the knowledge of the Vedic tradition in the practice of transcendental meditation as a practical means for achieving enlightenment. Dr. Joe Dispenza is actively healing millions of lives around the planet by teaching them how to activate their pineal glands through the use of meditation, breathwork to move cerebrospinal fluid into the third ventricle, sacred geometry, and sound technologies. The Gnostic Christians, the most instrumental group in spreading Christ's teachings in the centuries following his life and resurrection, emphasized the direct experience of the divine, or gnosis. Of course, all traces of Gnostic ideology were squashed by the Church Fathers following the Council of Nicaea, who instead forced a priest to serve as intermediaries to God. The Kukian of the Greeks' Eleusinian mysteries is now believed to be a psychedelic spiked wine that facilitated a glimpse into these higher states of consciousness. A mysterious formula which many now believe Jesus Christ also replicated in the original Eucharist. Masonic art always features two pillars, representative of the intellectual and direct experience for understanding consciousness. Christ's guidance on alchemy could not have been clearer. The kingdom of God is within you. And on and on and on. The science of consciousness and the practical application of internal alchemy is not a trivial matter. Quite the opposite. It represents the secret to unlocking humanity's next step in our evolution as we enter the age of Aquarius and are reacquainted with the exalted star Regulus. The ancient Egyptians deeply understood alchemy and astrology, a point which should be crystal clear by now. Their knowledge of the stars, like that of alchemy, can be found hidden within their monolithic structures, including, of course, the Sphinx.
The stars. If we look at the constellation of Leo and you have the bright star Regulus, now you've got a story that spans all around the world. Everyone talks about this because in India, the star Regulus is actually Magha, and it means the exalted one, the magnificent one. And it's supposed to be a sort of a royal star. It's associated with a kind of divine kingship. But they say that particular star forms a kind of gateway. It's a place where high knowledge or the mystery teachings originally came from. So within the series of the zodiac, for example, you have every constellation has its own specific function. Regulus and Leo, their function is to bring out information, like an astral reference library, if you like. That is a place that is defined as a location where you're going to get information that dates back all the way to kingship, when kingship was lowered from the heaven to earth, as the Sumerians used to call it. So it's that association with divine kingship which establishes the lion as part of that symbology.
10,450 BCE, Leo was on the horizon, and that's exactly where the Sphinx was looking.
In 5 Egyptian mysteries, I highlighted that while the Sphinx was indeed looking at Leo in 10,500 BC, it was also doing so in 36,400 BC, the age of Leo prior to last. And that this time, 38,500 years ago, while the Sphinx gazed towards the exalted star Regulus, the Giza pyramids were in perfect alignment with the stars of Orion's belt. These archaeoastrological alignments lend credence that these structures were not built 4,500 years ago, as mainstream Egyptology would have you believe. They were not built 12,500 years ago during the Younger Dryas period, as symbolists like Graham Hancock, Robert Bauval, and Edgar Cayce have suggested, but rather, as proposed by John Anthony West decades ago, that they were built 38,400 years ago. In 5 Egyptian mysteries, I also discussed the astrological theory that the cycles of time operate as reverberating waves, and that each age of the zodiac has a special relationship with its direct opposite. Present-day humanity is concluding our time at the age of Pisces and rapidly entering the age of Aquarius. And which constellation is the partner for Aquarius? You already know. Leo. In this age of Aquarius, what will we learn from Magha? Will the exalted star Regulus guide us back to our divine kingship? Will we restore the Egyptians' knowledge of consciousness, of alchemy and astrology? Will humanity fulfill our destiny, remove the curse of the forbidden fruit, and again enter into the garden of the Lord? Well, if I have anything to say about it, you can bet your ass we will.